Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Welcome to Saturday Storytelling. We begin today's program by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the homeland of the Selis Bay people at a place they named Timsum-Clee. Their example as the original stewards of this land guides our work today. Travelers Rest Connection is committed to respectfully sharing the history and contemporary culture of the indigenous people who lived and traveled through the ancient crossroads on this land. We learn from many indigenous artists, elders, and organizations. We invite you to learn from and support them as well. A quick thank you to everybody that makes these programs possible. As always, I start with the members of Travelers Rest Connection. Thank you so much. I also wanted to especially call out today MCAT, Missoula's community resource, who is who's broadcasting this over Zoom for us and providing recordings that we can then post on our website. Thank you to MCAT. I also want to give a shout out to Hunter Bay Coffee, our neighbors here in Lolo, for providing the delicious coffee this morning. And to the Hodgstons and Ben Dickinson for providing treats this morning. I will put the sign-up sheet out there later. If you haven't brought treats and you would like to, we'll make that happen. For the folks on Zoom today, I am going to mute everybody. I would prefer if you keep yourself muted during the presentation. You can type questions into the chat, or I will check in with folks at the end. Galen, our superstar techie, is on vacation this week, so I'm doing my best. And with that, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker. Greg Peters is the author of Our National Forests. He's the former director of communications at the National Forest Foundation, where he edited their magazine, which is called Your National Forest.
Yes. You got a lot of pronouns going on.
We're covering pronouns
Yeah, exactly.
today. Greg's writing has appeared in some of my favorite magazines, including National Parks, High Country News, Down East, Big Sky Journal, to name a few. He's also the author of a book called Stand Up Paddling Montana. And I know he's got a lot of fun things to share with us today. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Not too loud? All right. And can everybody see? Can you folks see the screen? All right, great. Well, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to Molly and Travelers Rest for having me out here. I was excited when I got the invitation a few months ago and have been looking forward to this. Yeah, as Molly said, I had the great fortune to write a book about national forests. It came out back in November of 21, so a little more than a year ago. And it was a really fun project to work on. The folks at Timber Press that published the book gave me a lot of leeway in terms of sort of crafting different narratives and finding different stories to tell about our national forests. They wanted it to be a little bit different than books out there about national forests. So it's not a history book, although there's a lot of history in it. It's not a photo book, although there are a lot of photos in it. And what it is basically a collection of narrative nonfiction stories that cover a topic about national forests. For example, wildfire, wildlife. There are a couple of chapters that look back at how the national forest system came to be. And recreation is one, wilderness is one, and I then tell some stories about those topics and their relationship to national forests. I also cover the connection between national forests and Native Americans. And also the final chapter is about diversity, equity, and inclusion on not just national forests, but on our public lands here in the U.S. in general. And as I said, it was a really fun project. Some of the chapters were a little more challenging for me to write than others. I'm a 44-year-old white guy who was born to an upper middle class family. So diving into the legacy and the history of the Native American and also the diversity and equity and inclusion chapters were a little challenging for me, but I think it was really important work to do and there were some important stories to share there. So I want to talk today a little bit about, I want to tell a couple stories, I guess, about the history of our national forests and the national forest system and how that came about, with a particular focus on the eastern national forests. which came about a little bit differently than the Western national forests. And then I want to talk about a part of the national forest system that a lot of folks may not be as familiar with, and those are our national grasslands. So included in the national forest system are many millions of acres of grasslands that the Forest Service manages for different values. And I want to talk a little bit about how those came to be part of the national forest system, since grasses are quite different from trees, obviously. And I know this is a Western audience. We're here in Western Montana. So I do want to set the stage a little bit by talking about what national forests are. And one way to do that, and I'm also going to read a little bit from the introduction of the book. So I'm going to read for a sec just to give folks a little bit more insight into what the book is about and how I structured it and what I hope to do with it. And then I'm going to dive into sort of setting some context about the national forests and then move into those two stories that I wanted to tell a little bit more about. And I know it's not always super exciting to listen to people read their books, so I'm going to try to keep this pretty brief. But I think it might help folks a little bit understand what I tried to do. So this book may be best described by what it's not rather than what it is, which is pretty close to the approach many board members and staff at the National Forest Foundation take when describing the forests to family members, neighbors, or colleagues. They're like national parks, but different. They harbor wildlife, but they're not wildlife refuges. They're working lands, but they're not like private timberlands with their directives to maximize profit. They're not this, but they're kind of, sort of, like that. This book is not exhaustive in its scope. There are simply too many stories to tell, histories to explore, tragedies and triumphs to highlight for any one book to cover them all. It is not a repudiation of the Forest Service or a record of its mistakes, nor is it a glowing commendation of the agency that has overseen these lands for the better part of a century and a half. It's not a history of the Forest Service or of each national forest. There are historians far more qualified to write that type of book than I, and many have, and I really encourage folks to actually check out some of those books. And if you have some questions, I'm going to be out at a table out here, happy to sign books and happy to answer questions after the formal question and answer session that'll follow. Mostly, this book is an exploration. The editors at Timber Press gave me a wide berth to choose stories, and I was free to follow where they led. I grounded this exploration in my own experiences and knowledge of our forests. I don't claim to be an expert, but I have spent the better part of my adult life immersed in these places, both literally, out in the woods, whether for fun or for hire, and professionally, mostly in front of a computer and as a conservation writer. Those experiences are, of course, mine and therefore limited. Certainly there are topics I wish I could have covered, or at least could have covered in more detail. Oh, skipping ahead. I was once someone who knew little to nothing about national forests. Just 20 years or so ago, free camping anywhere was the sum total of my knowledge. I can't claim that I've followed leave no trace principles every time I've camped or hiked in a national forest, and I've struggled to balance the righteous environmentalism that underlies many of my personal beliefs with the practical realities of managing a system as vast and altered as these lands. We live in the Anthropocene, a period in which our world is so manipulated by humans that it is defined by that manipulation. If nothing else, I hope this book shares the complexities of our national forests, the conflicting mandates that govern their management, the varied histories that have shaped them, the diverse characters who have played or continue to play their part in the sweeping saga of these lands. I truly hope this book, like our national forests, is interesting. So, what are national forests? And I've already had several folks come up who've worked with the Forest Service or who have been up at lookout towers for decades. But in my work at the National Forest Foundation, it became pretty apparent to me that not a lot of people in this country have a solid understanding of what national forests are, how they're managed, why they're managed the way that they are. So I like to start sort of my discussions and presentations, like I started the book, with a bit of context about what national forests are. So forgive me if I'm covering ground that folks here already know, but maybe you'll learn a little something new that you didn't know before. Obviously, they're public lands. They're managed by the U.S. Forest Service, a department under the Department of Agriculture, an agency under the Department of Agriculture. They're multiple use lands, and the column here on the right gets into some of those uses. And they're incredibly diverse. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk about national grasslands, so they're not just forests. They're managed for all of these different things, and in general, they're managed for all of those different things equally. So there's timber harvesting, there's oil, gas, and hard rock mining, there's grazing, there's obviously recreation, non-motorized, motorized, wilderness recreation, Vail Ski Resort, one of the Big Sky. They are on, I don't know if Big Sky is, but Vail certainly, and many others are on national forest land. So recreation is a huge component of the way that these are managed. They're managed for wildlife and fish habitat. And they're managed for water provision, which is actually one of the founding reasons that the national forests were established. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about that here in a second. And something that maybe we've lost a little bit in our public consciousness, that they're really managed in large part to provide Americans with clean water for all sorts of different things. And particularly now, they're managed for a host of other ecosystem services. Things like carbon storage, pollution control, flood control, all sorts of different stuff. And the Forest Service is mandated and tasked with managing for all of these things in a finite system of lands. I think it's a pretty complicated mission that they have, and one that I think they deserve some credit for trying to incorporate all these different management directives. They don't always succeed at each of them, but I think generally speaking, they've done a pretty good job of balancing these out over the last 150 or so years. As I mentioned in the book, when I worked at the NFF and we would explain what national forests are, we were often explaining them in relationship to national parks, which people do understand a little bit better in this country. And so I think this slide is helpful. Our national parks embody that vision of preservation, which was largely articulated, at least first, or perhaps best, by John Muir. They're managed to preserve ecosystems, to preserve wildlife populations, to preserve views. They're managed to facilitate public enjoyment. The Park Service was established in 1916, so roughly a decade or so after the Forest Service was officially established. It's part of the Department of Interior. It has about 12,500 employees. There are 420 units in the system, but 63 of those are what we consider national parks, our glaciers, our Yellowstones, our Grand Canyons, those crown jewels of America, as we like to call them. And all told, they cover about 85 million acres of land. The National Forest System covers more than twice that at 193 million acres of land. So we often think of, the sweeping landscape of Yellowstone or how big the Grand Canyon is, but really in sum, the National Forest System is significantly larger, more than twice as big as the National Park System. And then some of these recreational statistics I find really amazing and get at that size. There's 12,000 miles of trails, at least from the statistic in 2008, that I could find on national parks, and about 8,500 miles of roads. You compare that to 158,000 miles of trail on the National Forest System, and more than 350,000 miles of roads on the National Forest System. It's like 11 times the extent of the interstate highway system, just on national forests, and mostly dirt roads, mostly built for logging. So you start to see, I think, some of the management challenges. Certainly the National Park Service faces a lot of management challenges, but you really start, I think, to see when you look at the infrastructure and you look at the size and the scope of the National Forest System, how complicated it is, and how arguably difficult it has been for the Forest Service to succeed in managing all of these different things and all of these pieces of infrastructure. Importantly, national forests embody a vision of conservation. I talked about the vision of preservation that was articulated by John Muir. Well, a gentleman named Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief of the Forest Service and a close confidant of Theodore Roosevelt, and I'll talk a little bit more about Pinchot in a bit, but he sort of created this notion of conservation, of of conserving the natural resources but using them at the same time. Really kind of a sustainable use concept as we might consider it today. And was really sort of the father of conservation in that sense, in that we can use the natural resources and not exhaust them through our use of them. And here's a couple photos of the two gentlemen. They knew each other, though I don't think they probably chatted a lot. And there's some historians have done some really good work on both of those gentlemen, so there's a lot that folks can learn about them. Probably a lot of folks here are familiar with The Greatest Good, which has been turned into a movie of the same name. It's a documentary about Gifford Pinchot. And that comes from, I think this is a really interesting kind of anecdote, so maybe a small story in the history and the other stories of national forests. But in 1905, when Pinchot was the chief of the Forest Service, he had all these rangers, particularly out west, and they needed some instructions on what they were supposed to do. The Forest Service had just been created in 1905 officially. A different sort of version of it had existed prior to that. And so he wrote this letter and sent it out to all the rangers out who were managing all of these national forests. And the letter included this line in it. And I think it's really interesting to read this now and to read it in light of all of the conflicting interests that we see existing and butting heads for our national forests today. These issues have been around for more than a century, and they'll probably be around in another century. And so Pinchot's advice was to focus on the standpoint of the greatest good of the greatest number in the long run. And he took this concept from an English philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, who created the concept and the philosophy of utilitarianism, which basically meant that something was morally right if it benefited the most people that it could. And so Pinchot kind of tweaked that a little bit and applied it to conservation. And I think it's really interesting that this greatest good, greatest number in the long run, it's really about solving conflicts. It's really about resolving those challenges between natural resources management and water provision and grazing and all these different things. So I like to share that, and I think it also grounds that notion of conservation that Pinchot put forth, and that's sort of what he meant, I think, by that, by and large. Okay, if I point that at the right thing. So this is the system of national forests that we have now. 193 million acres, 175 units, which are effectively a national forest. The Lolo National Forest, for example, is a unit. They stretch from, let's see if I can do this. Yes, from Alaska, Puerto Rico. Has the El Yunque National Forest. It's the country's only tropical forest. And you'll see mostly they're in the west, though there are quite a few in the east, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And the gold color blotches here are the national grasslands. So you can see there is a part of the country that doesn't have a lot of national forests or national grasslands in it. And you can see that the bulk of these public lands are out west in terms of acreage and sort of quantity frequency. Now, you can't get to this map without stepping back and understanding where these chunks of land came from. And I did a fair bit of research in the book, and one of the things that I came across that I think, that I couldn't share in the book, obviously, because you'll see in just a moment, but that I think is really informative, and I like to share in these presentations, is this slide. And this moves pretty quick, and I'm going to slow it down for you in just a second. But this work was done by a scholar from, I think, Louisiana State University, and it runs through basically the Indian land secessions, starting in the late 1700s, and then moving up until the basically late 1800s, early 1900s. And so you start to see how we can go from something like this in 1784, 106 years later, we get to this. These are the present day reservations, which is pretty similar to where we were in 1890. And then you sort of see, okay, whoops, I missed my map. Let me go back. You see where this comes into play a little bit. So in the late 1800s, well, middle and late 1800s, as we were busy as a country moving west, taking land from Native Americans, somebody needed to decide what to do with that land, and that was up to the federal government. It became part of the public domain. And that land could be homesteaded from the Homestead Act of 1862. So anybody could come out and make a claim on 160 acres, well, the head of a household, so basically a white male could come out and make a claim on 160 acres. And if you fenced it and you tilled it and you did what you needed to do, built a cabin on it, it became yours. And a lot of that happened. But there were also other huge chunks of land that there just weren't enough settlers. And so that land was part of the public domain. There were debates as to what to do with that land. Should it be turned over to private interests, like eastern lands and midwestern lands? Should it be brought into the federal estate and managed by the federal government? And those debates played out during the middle 1800s up until the late 1800s. And that's one sort of parallel story that we're going to follow here a little bit in the creation of the National Forest System. So as I mentioned, the Homestead Act was in 1862. It took another decade or so for the government to even send somebody out to sort of figure out what they owned out here, what the land was. In 1891, Congress passed the Forest Reserve Act, which was really the first opportunity that the federal government provided the executive branch to set aside land from the public domain and bring it into the federal estate. And that's exactly what happened. Now, Yellowstone was created in 1872. That was through an act of Congress that chunked out Yellowstone and said, we're going to keep this and preserve this. But there wasn't a lot of other public land that became part of the federal estate until 1891. So in 1891, Congress said, all right, President, you can set aside forest reserves if you want. It took another few years for them to actually direct anybody on what to do with those forest reserves that they had set aside, and that is what we call the Organic Act, which is sort of the foundational act of what became the Forest Service. At the time, it was a different agency in the Department of Interior. And the language of the Forest Reserve Act I copied here, and I think it's really important. So it basically says that the president can, from time to time, set aside forest reserves with the sole purpose of improving and protecting the forest within the reservation, securing favorable conditions of water flows, very important, and to furnish a continuous supply of timber for the use and necessities of citizens of the United States. So starting in 1897, we see this water flow component of the management of our national forests. I'm going to move forward a little bit more quickly here. In 1905, Teddy Roosevelt pushes the Transfer Act through, which creates the Forest Service, led by Gifford Pinchot, moves the agency from Department of Interior into the Department of Agriculture. It also changes the, what did it do? I think it changes the name of the forest reserves to national forests, which Pinchot advocated to sort of alleviate some of the political pressure that they were feeling that forest reserves were just reserved and set aside, and they weren't to be managed, they were just to be reserved. So he wanted to change the naming of them to better articulate his vision for the active management that he was going to sort of implement on these lands. So they were changed from forest reserves to national forests. The story that I'm going to focus on a little bit actually happens 6 years after the Forest Service gets started, and that's the Weeks Act, which expands congressional authority to purchase lands and add them to the federal estate. And we're going to get into some of the specifics there, so I'm going to kind of breeze over those bullets. And then the last one I'm going to also talk about a little bit later happened in 1937, the Bankhead-Jones Farm Tenant Act, which was actually only partially about adding to the federal estate, but it did authorize the federal government to purchase degraded lands primarily in the Dust Bowl region and add those to the federal estate for rehabilitation as well. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So we saw that those slides where Native American land was drastically reduced. I mean, all of this land on this continent came from Native Americans, of course, but we've seen that slide. We've seen the map of our current national forest system. So in 1872, Yellowstone Park was created by Congress. And remember, in 1891, that was when they passed the Forest Reserve Act that gave the president the opportunity to set aside forest reserves. Benjamin Harrison was the president who signed that, and he immediately set aside 13 million acres in his administration. His successor, Grover Cleveland, actually his predecessor and his successor, interestingly enough, but as his successor, Cleveland set aside 25 million acres. McKinley only set aside 7 million, and he was succeeded by President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, who is generally considered, one of our great conservationists. And he set aside 200 million acres. He added those to the federal estate. They weren't just Western, and it wasn't just national forests. These other statistics were just national forests or forest reserves. Roosevelt added to the wildlife refuge system, to the national park system, but obviously there's a pretty substantial jump in the amount of acreage in those 9 years that Roosevelt was in charge. So you start to see, I think, here how we get to here. The last, sort of 5 minutes, got the land stole the land. We then needed to figure out what to do with it. Some of it went to private interests, some of it went to states, some of it went to individuals through the Homestead Act, and then a lot of it was pulled from that public domain and set aside into the federal estate. I also talked a little bit about how national forests are different than national parks. But I think another really interesting aspect of all of this is that many, and this is a pretty, I think, comprehensive list, though I probably missed a few, but many of our national parks are bordered by national forests, adding to sort of that conservation legacy and also maybe challenging the way that those landscapes are managed, particularly today when we start to see even more pressures on some of the boundaries of those lands. I think the greater Yellowstone ecosystem is probably the best example of this. The dark green here is Yellowstone. And then you can see there's 5 national parks, 5 national forests that surround it. Custer Gallatin, Beaverhead Deer Lodge, the Shoshone, the Bridger Teton, and the Caribou Targhee. And of course, Grand Teton is down here as well. And wildlife, bison, elk, they don't know, they don't care if they walk over to the Yellowstone boundary into the Bridger Teton or the Shoshone. These are political boundaries that we've set up as humans. And so this is also one of the best examples of all these different federal agencies, or these 2 different federal agencies, and these 7, 8 different management units working together to start to manage this as an entire landscape and not just as individual units with their own priorities. As I mentioned at the top, national forests aren't just forests in the traditional sense that we think of them. So the next few slides I'm going to move through pretty quick. I also mentioned that the book has a lot of photos in it. And these are some of the photos that I sourced for the book. And they give a really nice, I think, visual representation of how diverse these landscapes really are. This is down out of Sedona on the Coconino National Forest, which looks pretty different than, the Lolo, certainly. And this is on the Ocala National Forest in Florida. Silver Glen Springs is one of the largest freshwater springs in the east. Manatees come in here in the winter time to get out of the cold ocean. I mentioned the grasslands. This is up in the northern plains, the Dakota Prairie grasslands. I had mentioned El Yunque in Puerto Rico. And this is one of the oldest forest reserves in the Western Hemisphere. The King of Spain set this aside in the 1800s to protect the watershed for what was then a territory of Spain. And when the U.S. took control of Puerto Rico, I don't know the history there, they maintained this as a national forest. And Puerto Ricans take a huge amount of pride in El Yunque as a really important aspect of their country or their state or territory, whatever, I don't know, whatever they want to call it. Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area is a fascinating example of how the Forest Service works with state government with private landowners to manage a broad landscape. It's a really interesting designation. I get into it a little bit in the book, actually in the story about wildfire, but it is spectacularly gorgeous if you haven't been over there. The Forest Service is the sort of the large federal management agency. They co-manage a huge chunk of land along the gorge with the Columbia Gorge Commission. And it's a pretty interesting management scheme. So the Angeles National Forest, just outside of LA, it's like a 2-hour drive or an hour drive from 15 million people. It's one of the most urban forests in the country. And it's also super rugged. I've had the opportunity to be down there before. Those San Gabriel Mountains are insanely steep. And they're covered in prickers and all sorts of stuff that'll poke you. And we did some tree planting work down there when I worked at the NFF, and it was a rugged, pretty interesting environment. And it's so close. It also, I think a lot of people think that, LA gets all its water from the Colorado River. The Angeles provides, I think, a third of LA's drinking water. Farther south, and I guess a little bit east from the Angeles, you got the Coronado down in Arizona, southern Arizona, where you got saguaro cacti. Again, just a totally different landscape than what we have up here, and also part of the National Forest System. In the Midwest, you've got the Garden of the Gods on the Shawnee in Illinois. If I had shown this slide without the caption, I bet no one in this room would have thought that it was from Illinois. And then, of course, back east, you got the White Mountain in New Hampshire. And then this is outside of Aspen, Colorado, the Maroon Bells. That rivals a photo from Glacier or from another national park. And then, of course, our beloved backyard forest, right? You can't do a presentation here without throwing that one in there. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the story of eastern forests and circling back onto that water. I think Pinchot actually came up with this quote. It might have been Pinchot, it might have been somebody else, but no forests, no water. And it's been a concept that people have understood for millennia. If you cut down the high elevation forested watershed, it's going to degrade your water supply. You're going to have flooding, you're going to have sediment runoff, you're going to have all sorts of issues. This photo is from Pittsburgh. It's from a flood in 1907 that inundated Pittsburgh. I think it caused $100 million in 1907 money in damage. And it was blamed squarely on deforestation of the upper elevation watersheds. So while the government was figuring out how to deal with the public domain lands in the West, it was also figuring out what to do with private timberlands in the East and the Midwest that had been pretty heavily ravaged. And so this gentleman, John Weeks, plays a big role in figuring that out. He was from New Hampshire, moved to Massachusetts as a young man, opened a successful finance business, and like many people who make a lot of money in finance, moved into government and got a job in Congress from Massachusetts. So this is, I think, an interesting slide, and I know I'm running a little short on time, so I'm going to try to speed things up here. In Michigan, in 1869, the Sawyers produced 1.7 billion board feet of white pine alone. In 1879, 10 years later, that almost doubled to 3 billion board feet. In 1931, what's that, almost, 50 years later, 67,000 board feet. Why? Because they cut all of the trees down. There were no more trees that they could cut. Wisconsin, similar statistics. New Hampshire, similar statistics. Maine, similar statistics. In Appalachia, a 1908 Secretary of State report that I found has a quote that basically said 86% of southern Appalachia had been cleared of forests, was either regrowing after recent clearing or was young second growth forest, and practically all of it, whether cut or not, had been burned. What happens is you cut the trees, a fire comes through, it burns all the shrubs, it burns all the grasses, it makes the soil, it bakes the soil. It makes it almost impossible to farm. The concept was you cut the trees, you open it up for farming. When the fires came through, people couldn't farm very successfully, so they abandoned those farms. And you end up with pretty bad devastation, you end up with downstream floods. So between 1901 and 1911, there were more than 40 bills introduced in the Congress to figure out a way to protect these eastern forests that had been so ravaged by private industry. And none of them made any headway. And then John Weeks was assigned the task of figuring out how to write a law that would do that. And he figured it out through the Interstate Commerce Clause of the US Constitution. Because the federal government could regulate interstate commerce, he reasoned that navigable waterways were critical to interstate commerce. High elevation forested watersheds were critical to making rivers navigable to facilitate trade. So therefore the government could buy land and restore high elevation watersheds to maintain the navigability of rivers to maintain interstate commerce. So it was kind of a legal stepping stone, but it worked. And they passed a law in 1911, and they started buying up some land. And this gentleman, Gifford Pinchot, at the time in 1911 was not actually the chief of the Forest Service anymore. But a few years prior to that, about a decade prior to that, well, 2 decades, excuse me, he had started basically the concept of forestry in the United States almost single-handedly. And he was aided by this gentleman, well, not this gentleman, but the gentleman who built this house, which is the Biltmore Estate down out of Asheville, North Carolina, George Vanderbilt. So Vanderbilt, obviously a Gilded Age bajillionaire, he started buying up a bunch of the land outside of the Biltmore that had been cut over and burned over. And he hired a young Pinchot fresh out of college to figure out how to restore that land and bring it back into forests. And so that's what Pinchot did for several years before he ended up moving over to become the chief of the Forest Service. And that really set the groundwork for what the Forest Service did in the eastern and midwestern forests and what they're even really still doing today, which is a story of restoration. So Pinchot learned and honed forestry skills in Europe after graduating from Yale, came back, worked for Vanderbilt at the same time that the federal government figured out a way to start purchasing lands that had been cut over and bringing them into the federal estate. And so the forestry and particularly restoration practices that he and his successors learned and then trained on, in part on Vanderbilt's land, sort of laid that foundation for the restoration of those watersheds and the restoration of eastern forests. And now if you go back east, they do not look like they're cut over lands at all. I mean, they're beautiful, almost old growth forests. It's pretty amazing that transformation that has happened over the last couple of 100 years. And I think this is a neat slide. So this is a Forest Service Girls Club in 1936 up in Michigan on the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. And they did this plantation. And they were super proud of the planting of the trees that they did. And I just think it's kind of a neat slide. This is from the mid-1930s, or late 1930s, 1939. And these are a couple of the landscapes. The Pisgah, that's the land that Vanderbilt bought that his widow in 1914 sold to the federal government. I think it was 70,000 acres shortly after the Weeks Act was passed. And it is a verdant, beautiful forest now. I mean, you would have no idea that was, had been effectively clear-cut and burned 150 years before. And similarly in the White Mountains, which actually is where John Weeks had a summer cabin up in the White Mountains. And that was in part what inspired him to try to address this problem. There was a bad wildfire up there. So between 1911 and 1945, we had 24 million acres to the National Forest System in 23 different states. Here's just a couple examples of some of the landscapes over there, some of the forests. The Monongahela in West Virginia, the Cherokee in Tennessee, Green Mountain in Vermont, and the Chattahoochee-Oconee in Georgia. And when we looked at that map of the National Forest System, most of the green was in the west. The national forests were mostly in the west. a lot of the people in this country live in the East. And so you actually have almost 200 million people, about 60% of the US population, is a day's drive from one of these eastern national forests. And without that Weeks Act, without that restoration effort that happened, they would have very different watersheds, very different water supplies, and very different recreational and other opportunities back east. How's everybody doing? We good? Rocking and rolling? What time is it?
4:45.
Ooh.
We started a little late.
Okay, I'm gonna go through this one quick because I want to make sure there's some time for questions, and I'm happy to stay a little bit later if other folks are. Okay, so we talked a little bit about how the eastern forest came in. We're going to talk a little bit about how the grasslands became part of this system. And interestingly, not just including the grasslands, I think a little less than half of the national forest system is classified as rangeland. So when I talk about these diverse ecosystems, even from the get-go, when it was still a largely Western phenomena, rangeland was a huge component of these landscapes. And the Forest Service was actually the first federal agency that established grazing protocols and grazing rules and things like that in the early 1900s for the grazing lands that they managed under the National Forest System. The BLM and other agencies adopted the rules that the Forest Service first set out in terms of managing grazing lands. So, I open this chapter actually with an excerpt from a book written by this woman, Eliza Steele. In 1840, this woman from New York did a big trip. She went out west onto the frontier and ended up in the tallgrass prairie just south of Illinois, and wrote some really beautiful passages about what she witnessed there and about the wildflowers and just sort of the beauty that she saw there. Well, 2 years before she got there, this gentleman, who we know, invented this plow. And so in 1938, John Deere invents this plow. He lived in Decatur, Illinois, I think, or something like that at the time. In 1840, Eliza Steele does her trip, rhapsodizes about the beauty of tallgrass prairies and prairies in general on the frontier. About 15 years later, John Deere had sold 10,000 of his plows. 7 years after that, the Homestead Act came. And by 1892, there were 6 million people living in the Great Plains. It's a pretty rapid transition between what had been there and the changes that this plow in particular wrought. And one of the big changes was the fact that plow in large part led to the tilling up of all that topsoil, which then once drought came in the 1930s, created the Dust Bowl. There are, of course, some other parallel stories. So those 6 million people didn't come to an empty landscape. They came to a landscape that had lots of other millions of people living on it. But those people weren't as welcome as they had been previously. And one of the big ways that they were made to not feel very welcome and to not be able to exist was through the mass slaughtering of bison, which is a pretty tragic story here in America. It's estimated between 30 and 60 million bison roamed the plains in the early 1800s. By 1883, there were 325 wild bison left in North America. One of the greatest faunal populations on Earth ever was wiped out in 80 years, basically. And along with it, the capacity for Plains Indians to exist and their entire, basically, worldview and life. So we've got the Great Plains. There's no more Native Americans. There's no more bison. The homesteaders are there. John Deere's selling his plow like crazy. The topsoil blows away in the 1930s, and the Dust Bowl hits, and as does the Great Depression, obviously. So FDR implements a few programs specifically to address these, they called them blow hazards, these lands that were so degraded that they couldn't really be used for anything. They created the Soil Erosion Service in 1933. That becomes the Soil Conservation Service in 1935. That is now the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is still works. I actually have a contract in communications for them. They work on private lands. In 1937, that Bank-Jones Farm Tenant Act was passed, and there were two reasons for that, or two purposes for that law. One, it gave low-rate loans by the federal government to African-American farmers so they could buy land and farm it as opposed to being tenant farmers, which was great for them. But it also allowed the federal government to purchase these blow hazards, these lands that had been degraded, and to bring them into the federal estate and to start to restore them. And they did that through the 1940s. The Soil Conservation Service, in partnership with the Forest Service, did restore those lands, figured out how to get vegetation back on them. They were helped by some wetter weather. And in 1954, the Soil Conservation Service transferred those now restored lands to the Forest Service as national grasslands. And in 1960, they were officially designated as national grasslands. So I think this is another really interesting story of restoration and story of healing, of ecological healing, that the Forest Service, I think, deserves a lot of credit for, or these other federal agencies as well. You know, in the east, we had the degradation of the upper elevation watersheds. In the Great Plains, we had the degradation of the prairies. And today, thanks to all of these efforts and to the work that has been done, both of those ecologies have rebounded by and large, which I think is pretty cool and gives us hope for maybe some of the damage that we're still doing to the natural environment today. It's 20 national grasslands in 12 states. 13 of those are in the Great Plains states. There's actually one in Oregon and a couple in California, I think. They total 4 million acres. They host roughly 1 million visitors, which is a pretty small fraction of the visitation on national forests in general, but they're pretty small. You've got 193, or I guess 189 million acres of forests and 4 million acres of grasslands, but nonetheless. And they provide a ton of ecosystem services. I read a speech by Tom Tidwell, chief of the Forest Service, from, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, and he quoted $6 billion a year in value just from pollination on just the national grasslands. One interesting subset of the national grassland is the national tallgrass prairie called Medewan, which is outside of Illinois. And that's why I started talking a little bit about Eliza Steele. She traveled through this area. In the early 1940s, the U.S. government was entering World War II. It bought up a bunch of lands about an hour outside of Chicago, old, small farming family lands, built the Joliet Arsenal, two huge military complexes that built like 2 billion tons of TNT up until the 1970s. So there were two plants. There was the one that manufactured the TNT, and then there was the other one that put the TNT into all of the bombs. It employed 10,000 people. In the 80s, they shuttered it, decided that they didn't want it anymore, tried to figure out what to do with it, and ended up giving it to the Forest Service in 1996, about 20,000 acres. And the Forest Service decided that it was going to restore that to a tallgrass prairie, to a native tallgrass prairie. And so they've been doing that for the last 30 years. It's a really interesting, really cool landscape, one that not a lot of people know about. It's relatively small. I was fortunate to, when I worked at the National Forest Foundation, to be able to help bring bison back to that landscape. Bison had been extirpated from Illinois, I think, in the early 1800s, long before the timeline that I showed a little bit ago. And so we were able to work with a private rancher in South Dakota. We got 23 females and 4 bulls, brought them to Medewan, which had built a bunch of pasture for them, double fence, big fence pasture and all this stuff, and let them roam as part of a restoration experiment to see how they would potentially help restore the native plant structure through their grazing. Obviously, the native plants in the tallgrass prairie co-evolved with bison and other herbivores, and so they brought bison in part to sort of conduct a long-term experiment to see how they might help restore those lands. And now there's, I think, God, the last I checked, there was 75 or 80 bison, so they're doing super well there. They seem to like it. And the other reason they brought them, there's 2 million people that live in Chicago, and almost none of them had ever heard of Medewin until there were bison there. And now people like to come out to Medewin and see the bison, which there's a maxim in conservation circles, people, once they know something, they might come to love it, and once they love it, they might work to protect it. And so that's sort of the logic that follows in a lot of this work that the Forest Service and other entities do to try to get people interested, right? Travelers Rest, that's probably a large part of why I'm here today, right? So folks come down, learn a little bit about this, and then want to help engage in it. So this is another, I think, really modern but also really fascinating restoration success story, still ongoing. It doesn't look much like a native tallgrass prairie right now, but in another 20, 30 years, it might. And that's about it. I do like to end with this slide because I think it's pretty amazing. So just a couple years ago, Randy Moore, who was the Region 5 supervisor, I think is what it is, the head of California National Forests, was appointed as the 20th chief of the Forest Service by the Biden administration, the first African American or black chief in the agency's history. And that paralleled Deb Haaland, the first Native American ever appointed to Secretary of Interior, and also Chuck Sams, who's the first Native American to ever be appointed to the head of the Park Service. So we've now got a black chief of the Forest Service and 2 Native Americans heading up 2 of the biggest, or some of the biggest federal land management agencies around, which I think is pretty awesome. So I think that's about it for me. I want to make sure there's a couple of moments for questions. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. I hope I didn't put you to sleep. Thanks.
Go back and monitor the chat from Zoom and see if people there have questions. I need to ask, because of the way we're mic'd up, if folks in the room ask a question, can you repeat it so the folks on Zoom can hear it?
Absolutely.
All right.
I hope there's questions.
Are we still gaining acreage in national forests?
That's a great question. Yeah, are we still gaining acreage in national forests, was the question. Yes, there are often private land swaps that happen. So there's a checkerboard pattern of ownership still in the West primarily, where you'll get a section of land that's privately owned, a section of land that's publicly owned, and it's checkerboarded. And where there are inholdings that are completely surrounded by public land, there are often land swaps. And so that's one way that the national forest system is growing. It's a bit of a give and take. So I don't know that on the whole we're gaining a lot of acreage from that because we're giving away other acreage. And then within the federal estate more broadly, there are certainly examples of private philanthropy donating land, or private philanthropists donating land to the federal government. The most recent one that I know of that was fairly prominent was a woman named Roxanne Quimby, who started Burt's Bees, which we're probably all familiar with, bought a bunch of land in Maine adjacent to a state park and donated it to the federal government, and it's now a national monument that President Obama established back in the aughts, I guess. So there are still examples of that as well. Yeah, great question, thank you. Others? Yes?
This could probably take a whole other meeting, but what about the friction between the timber industry, mining industry, and our national forests?
Sure. So the question was about the conflict of friction between mining, timber, natural resource extraction, and national forests. Yes, I think that could take not just another session, but a lifetime to unpack. I think that gets to the really difficult management mandate that the Forest Service has. These lands were set aside in the late 1800s, 1900s, and laws have been written all the way up through the 1970s that direct the Forest Service to allow for those types of activities to occur on those lands. There are other laws that allow public participation in those types of projects being developed, and I think it's incumbent on us, whatever side of the coin we fall on, to become engaged in those public processes opportunities. I think a really pertinent example right now, the Lolo National Forest is updating its and revising its forest plan. Right now, they launched the process last month, and it's going to be ongoing for the next couple of years. And there will be opportunities within that planning process for the public to weigh in and say, timber harvest, mining might be appropriate in this zone, but not appropriate over here, where recreation is more appropriate or where wildlife is more valued. But if we're not showing up and participating in those processes, then the people who do show up, who are probably going to be well-funded industry groups who have professionals who show up, and there are certainly professional conservationists as well, they're going to be the ones at the table that the Forest Service is listening to, and the ones that are providing the public input that the Forest Service is going to say, well, the public's telling us we want more natural resource extraction, so that's what we're going to do. So it's a fascinating I think, sort of interplay. And I have a line in the book where I call our national forests sort of mirrors of our society. And when the book came out, I did a lot of interviews on the radio, and people really kind of grabbed onto that particular line and asked me what I meant by it. And I think it's relevant to your question. If we decide that wildlife, water, and recreation are more important values than timber and mining and grazing, then we need to elect leaders who enact those laws, and those laws will filter down into the management of our national forests and other public lands. If we don't feel that way as a society, and we don't participate in the election process or in the public processes that allow us to influence or at least guide how our public lands are managed, then they're going to be managed by the people who are showing up. And they're probably going to be those, industries, because they're pretty heavily vested in ensuring that the timber keeps coming, that the mines keep operating. I think there's a balance. I think Pinchot articulated or wanted to articulate that balance. And there are certainly traditions that are hard to ignore. Grazing is so codified on public lands. It's such a part of the public land concept that it was allowed it's one of the allowed uses in wilderness areas, capital W wilderness areas, which are congressionally designated. You can't ride a mountain bike in a wilderness area. You can't take a chainsaw into a wilderness area to fight a wildfire. You can't use mechanical or motorized or anything in a wilderness area, but you can graze sheep and cattle in wilderness areas. Because in 1964, when they passed the Wilderness Act, they had to concede that that was a use that could continue. So, it's such a big question. I think it really comes down to our willingness to engage and participate in how these lands can be managed, as frustrating and as slow and as bureaucratic as that can be. We're really fortunate that in the 1970s and 60s, Congress did provide those opportunities for us through the National Environmental Policy Act and the National Forest Management Act that allow people to engage in how their public land should be managed. And if we're not stepping up and doing that, I think that's on us.
Yeah.
So, you can repeat this question as well, I guess. What kind of educational programs does the National Forest have to help draw more people into the conversation and educate young people about their responsibilities?
That's the question was what, sorry, I'm getting used to this repeating thing. The question was what sort of educational programs and outreach does the U.S. Forest Service do to bring people into those engagement opportunities and to let them know sort of, about the management of these lands. So I think I actually have some insight in this, having worked at the National Forest Foundation in close cooperation with the Forest Service to do just that, to make people more interested in these lands and provide them with those opportunities. And it is a challenge. It is a huge challenge. I mentioned, the large population of our country lives on the eastern seaboard. They are not close to national forests. They don't go out their backyard and see the Lolo like we do. and they don't know where their water comes from. They don't know that it comes, if they live in Atlanta, they don't know that it comes from the Chattahoochee-Oconee, and it's 100, 200, 300 miles away. So it's a challenge that the Forest Service has tried all kinds of different things to do, from sort of public awareness campaigns to podcasting to videos, all different kinds of stuff. I don't know how well they're succeeding in cutting through all that noise, to be honest with you. That being said, when I worked at the National Forest Foundation, and again, this is a small example, there were 12 or 15 employees. I think they have 75 now. In just 10 years, or not even. So, and I do think, COVID certainly changed the narrative of outdoor spaces. All of a sudden, indoor spaces were not safe, and outdoor spaces were the safe place to be. So people started going outside a lot more, and I think that then they said, well, wait, where am I? Am I on a county park? Am I in, where can I go? Where else can I go? And so I do think there's probably some boost to the sort of general education of the American population about public lands as a result of COVID, maybe a silver lining. But I think we as a community that's interested in these topics need to kind of take that and leverage it. Now, specifically, the Lolo, you can subscribe to their email, and they'll send you an email when they have ranger talks. They had one last week, I think, and they're trying to engage the greater Missoula, Sealy Lake, where the Lolo is. They're trying to engage those communities in this forest plan revision process, so that they're getting that input up front, so that it's collaborative up front. But you have to kind of actively sign up to receive those things, or you have to happen to be looking through the newspaper, if anybody does that anymore, and see the public notice in the classifieds or whatever that there's a meeting, wherever it is. So again, I think it's really up to us in large part to become engaged, and the Forest Service is doing its best to kind of meet people where they are, but it's a big challenge for sure. Others?
Is it different goals for each of the different forests? Are certain forests known for, like that's kind of a wildlife forest, this one's a timber production forest? Because it seems like the natural resources that are on the ground would kind of determine which of those might have more priority over the others.
Yeah, so the question is, are different forests sort of more known for or more associated with certain activities, whether it's natural resource extraction, timber, or recreation, or mining? And the answer is yes. They're not cutting a lot of, Doug fir ponderosa from the Coronado, right? They don't grow there. So forests in the Pacific Northwest, those are timber production forests still. They're wet, they grow trees really well, and to be honest, that's probably not an inappropriate use for that type of forest that grows trees really well. Same in the Southeast, those forests grow trees so fast. But yeah, there's no timber production on Medewin, obviously, right? So yeah, and the White River National Forest in Colorado, I think, is a great example. I think there's 10 or 11 major ski resorts on that national forest. Vail, Breckenridge, blah, 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 Beaver Creek, millions of dollars, more than billions of dollars in real estate, et cetera. And that is what that forest is used for. It is a recreational forest. There's some mining still that happens, but yeah, the Forest Service has generally sorted that out. So when I say all these uses are co-equal, that's true, but it's also sort of spread across the entirety of the system. It doesn't mean that on each forest there's timber and mining and grazing and recreation. That might be true if that forest can support those. The Lolo is a good example, but it's not true across the entire system. Yes, ma'am.
Just briefly, don't you think people are more aware of the national forest due to the wildfires?
Do I think people are more aware of national forests now due to the increase of wildfires? Yes, I do. But again, I think I think these things tend to get a little confused in our public consciousness a lot of the time. For example, the bad fires that have happened in California in the last couple of years, they weren't on national forest lands, by and large. They were on other landscapes. So yes, I think people are becoming much more aware that national forests are a thing and they have a bad fire problem, but they may not be able to differentiate exactly where those events are happening and if they're impacting national forests particularly. The chapter about wildfire or the story about wildfire that I tell in the book, it was the Eagle Creek fire that happened on the Columbia River Gorge National Scenic Area back in 2017. There were some kids, teenager was playing with fireworks on Labor Day and threw the fireworks in the woods, started a huge fire. Ecologically, the fire was not particularly damaging. 15% of it burned severely, 85% of it was moderate or mild. Those forests are fire adapted, like most forests in this country. They need some sort of regular fire. It burned a few bridges, some bridges and some trails that people really liked. Portland freaked out about that fire. I mean, we at the National Forest Foundation, we never raised any money post-wildfire. We had tried a few times. We raised hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to fundraise off of that fire. People wrote songs about it. It was like an 85,000 acre fire. I think like 4 million acres of national forests in Oregon also burned in 2017. And I don't think anybody would know what forest they were on or where they were or anything. So the wildfire thing is so dependent on, I think, the human response to the human loss and the devastation that happens. And when people are proximate to it and it happens in an area that they love and there's millions of people that live there, it becomes a real big thing. But when it happens hundreds of miles away, people don't notice. They don't really, it's not a part of their life, even though their water may be affected downstream. So I think it's happening, but I think it's also, people aren't necessarily making that connection quite as well as we might hope that they do. Yes?
So clearly you've been to a lot of these national forests, national prairies. Do you have a top 5 list of your top 5 favorite national forests, national grassland?
Sure. So the question is, do I have a top 5 favorite list? And I did get this question a fair amount. Usually if people ask me what was my favorite one, I said the Lolo, because it was easy. And it's true. I mean, I think it's so funny. I use the line like, I go to Glacier when family comes and visits. I go to the Lolo every Saturday, every Sunday for my own enjoyment, right? And that's partially because we live down here. But even when I lived in Whitefish, we went to Glacier occasionally, and we went to the Flathead most of the time because that's where. So the Lolo is high on that list. I was fortunate years ago to live up in the Chugach up in Alaska, which is just amazing. So that's a really cool one. While I've never been there, I would love to visit the Superior, particularly the Boundary Waters Canoe Wilderness area, which is the most visited wilderness area in the country. That just seems amazing. I'm a big paddler. I think that would be awesome. Oh, geez, I got a chance to spend some time down on the Beartooth Plateau in the Custer Gallatin, which was pretty amazing. And then I think my wife and I had a chance to be down in southern Arizona this January and poking around in the Coronado with those saguaro cacti, and that whole ecosystem is just amazing. So I would put that one up pretty high on the list as well.
So thanks again. Shameless plug. Greg will be selling books, and Greg will be signing them outside shortly. And we'll keep some in the visitor center in the gift shop for folks who couldn't be here with us today. I did want to point out that on your chairs there are these little flyers about the annual meeting of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, which we are going to be hosting in June. There's lots of information on our website, so please check it out. You'll get to hear from lots of great presenters like Greg about a whole lot of different topics. And next week, I don't know if we're going to get a chance to continue this conversation exactly, but Corey Williamson from the American Prairie Reserve is going to be our speaker next week. Cool. Although she's coming really to read her poetry. Corey, in addition to being involved in conservation of the prairie in Montana, is a poet, and she is from the same small hometown where Julia Clark, William Clark's wife, was born, and she's taken some specific inspiration from the Lewis and Clark story and Julia Clark. So we're going to be hearing from her, reading from her book, which is called The River Where You Forgot My Name, Because, you know, William Clark named the Judith River after his girlfriend Julia. Go figure. So that will be next week. Thanks to everybody for coming. We had 23 people on Zoom today, so it was a good crowd, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you all so much.